High on its hill, overlooking the sea at Aberystwyth, the National Library of Wales. Founded 100 years ago, the people's living memory, a storehouse of beloved things. Each book and object a witness to the countless human stories that shaped the epic of Wales. One is the story you're about to hear. Monday night in Pontypridd, and the fists are flying. At the boxing gym in the Hawthorne Leisure Centre, a crowd of boys and young men go through their punching paces.
That's better, Kane, well done. Chin down nice and tight now.
Under the eye of veteran coach Alan Jones, some of the boys learn the basics of attack and defence in the ring.
OK, time. Right, you didn't there just look at him, yeah? The heaviest, you reckon, him or you? You let him dominate you because you're not throwing the punches.
They're joining a tradition that's coloured the history of this part of Wales for more than 100 years. In the early part of the 20th century, South Wales produced a string of famously plucky world-class fighters. And one of the best, to many minds the greatest, was the man we see here on the left, winning again, the legendary Freddie Welsh. The Welsh Wizard, of course, winner of 120 professional fights, lightweight champion of the world from 1914 to 17. He made his fortune with his fists, lived the good life in Britain and America, and died tragically young.
During the First World War, Freddie Welsh was a name in international sport. Quicksilver feet and a fearsome punch, a magician in the ring. Today his name is all but forgotten. But there exists an exciting and revealing record of Freddie and his fighting life. And the place to see it is the National Library of Wales.
This stately home of books may not seem the most obvious place to delve into the world of a boxing star, but the library's net is wide. In the nation's memory, boxers and scrum halves have their popular place alongside princes, poets and politicians. The library honours the careers of Wales's sporting heroes, and one of the figures it celebrates is Freddie Welsh. These are his scrapbooks, fat volumes, compiled perhaps by Freddie himself or one of his family. They were discovered in the attic of his New York home many years after his death. His daughter gave them to the National Library because Freddie always had strong feelings for Wales.
The scrapbooks are crammed with cuttings from British and American newspapers, a blow-by-blow record of famous Fred's career. In a sense, the chronicle of a self-made man, for Freddie shaped his own image and knew exactly what the newspapers wanted. He told them that his idea of relaxing after a fight was not a nightclub, but to curl up in his own bed with a copy of Ibsen, the Norwegian dramatist. He promoted himself as a fighter with a difference, a brain box with punch.
And as the reporters scribbled, he wasn't just spinning a line, he really was out of the ordinary.
People don't normally credit boxers with a great deal of intelligence, but I think it's fair to say that Freddie Welsh was an intellectual, and more than that, he was a unique individual. Personal fitness is a thread that permeates the whole of his life, and in many ways he was years ahead of his time in that he was a vegetarian.
The press latch on to this. He is known as the fruitarian, the vegetarian philosopher phenom. That's the Los Angeles Times. So he attracts attention because of that, and because he's a dandy. He's a snappy dresser. Now this, again, was an aspect of Freddie's image that he was glad to cultivate. Freddie will always exert this almost kind of animal magnetism to female admirers, and he knew it.
It's clear that Freddie Welsh was not only quick in the ring, outside it too, he was as sharp as he was ambitious. As I become engrossed in his scrapbooks, I feel the story taking shape as a thriller. I want to know what happens next. The beginning, though, was Pontypridd. The boy who would later give himself the fighting name of Freddie Welsh was born here on the 5th of March in 1886. His real name was Frederick Hall Thomas, and his background quite different from that of the usual Valley's boxers.
So many of our champions have fitted the stereotype of the hungry fighter perfectly. Many of them were brought up in abject poverty. Freddie, on the other hand, came from a very privileged background compared to the typical Welsh fighter.
His father, Johnny Thomas, was an auctioneer. And there was enough money in the family to send the young Freddie to be educated privately at a boarding school in Bristol. He possibly then developed through necessity the ability to defend himself.
Freddie always said he hated his school days. Maybe he was bullied, and maybe that prompted his almost obsessive interest in physical fitness that developed at that time and lasted for the remainder of his life.
In his single-minded way, Freddie took control of his own body. To make himself fitter and improve the breathing ailment that had undermined him since childhood, he started a regime of long country walks and other exercises. Gradually, he became stronger. By the time he left school at the age of 15, he was fit enough to work at an iron foundry in the Rhondda. It was tough, but it was what he wanted. And then the return of his breathing difficulties led to a dramatic change of course.
In 1902, only 16, Freddie sailed for America, aiming for California and a cure for all his health problems. But he got stuck in New York and had a wretched time of it and returned to Wales penniless. Freddie, though, was a determined boy, raised some more money, went back to America. Again, he was in for a nasty surprise.
America was in the economic doldrums, and like many of his fellow immigrants, Freddie found himself living hand to mouth. It was hard to survive on the streets of New York, and he left the city, headed west to Kansas, to search for a job and a square meal. But this adventure and his hopes came to nothing. He was young and lost in America.
He was hungry at that point, there's no doubt about that. He's riding the rails, living really the life of a tramp. And there also he finds he has to defend himself by the skills he has in his fists to survive. We find him then arriving in Philadelphia, where he attends physical education classes and develops himself physically. He realizes he can fight. That skill has certainly been honed by his existence riding the rails, and so he decides to take up boxing on its own account. At this time also, very interestingly, he decides to change his name. And what name does he take? Well, Frederick Hall Thomas becomes Freddie Welsh. Clearly he's very conscious of himself as a Welshman, and he is pinning his national colours to the mast.
Under his new name, Freddie Welsh made his first appearance as a professional in Philadelphia, December 1905. It was a tough debut. His opponent was strong and experienced. Everyone watching expected the new boy to crash. But everyone watching had to think again. Freddie was an instinctive, intelligent fighter, and he was already showing the skills that would be the hallmarks of his style and career.
Defensively, he was one of our finest ever boxers. He had a classic left jab. He'd perfected his defensive technique to the point of artistry. And of course, he served his apprenticeship in the rings of Philadelphia. An extremely tough place, tough environment to learn his trade. And I think that was crucial in turning him into the complete fighter. When you think he was so far away from home, boxing in the toughest of schools, his early career is absolutely amazing.
Freddie scored his first victory, made the crowd sit up. It was just the beginning. Over the following 12 months, he won 25 fights and lost none. He was on his way. The hungry days were over.
Freddie Welsh was now living his dream, making his name as a professional fighter in America. In 1906, he hurried home to Wales to visit his sick mother. But there was no public welcome at Pontypridd station. No one had heard of Freddie Welsh of America. Here he was plain Fred Thomas. So he vowed that next time there would be a cheering crowd. And to that end, he set out to make himself a star on this side of the Atlantic.
Freddie's battle plan depended on finding a shrewd manager. 2 fights he arranged himself in January of 1907 brought him to the eye of one of the best, the Cardiff promoter, Harry Marks. But their relationship didn't get off to a good start.
Mark thought he looked like a foreigner, with his black sombrero and his heavy overcoat, cape even. I mean, there's a touch of the sort of Clint Eastwoods here, you know, if not the man with no name, Josie Wales, except he's not Josie Wales, he's Freddie Welsh. He's something of an unknown quantity and is exotic. He's also very good in the ring. Mark spots ability and takes Freddie up and promotes his career in London.
The first thing Harry Marks did as Freddie's manager was to arrange 2 big fights. He staged them here in Covent Garden at number 43 King Street, then the home of the National Sporting Club. Freddie won them both, beating powerful opponents, and his British career was triumphantly on its way.
Freddie's dramatic performance made a deep impression on the hard-nosed boxing journalists of the day. They hailed a new star, the boy from Pontypridd. But Pontypridd itself was not so impressed. Most people in the town hadn't heard of this Freddie Welsh, and even those who had couldn't believe that Johnny Thomas's skinny kid had grown into a real fighter. But they soon had their chance to judge for themselves. Freddie was determined to come home to Wales, to Pontypridd, and prove himself in front of his own people. To hear what happened next, I met Glyn Moses, who was a schoolboy when he first read an article about Freddie Welsh, and since then he's been a devoted fan, reading everything about Freddie he can find. We met at an appropriate rendezvous, the Bunch of Grapes pub in Pontypridd. It was once run by Freddie's aunt and was the place where he did some training in 1907.
Glyn, what does Freddie Welsh mean to you?
He was a hero of mine from the start. And I started to read about him, and he went up and up and up in my estimation. And my impression, there should be a statue in Pontypridd as big as the statue of Eros. And they got nothing near him at all. I think it's shameful.
And you've been studying his life for 50 years?
50 years, yeah. And he's getting better all the time.
When he came back home to Pontypridd in 1907, he had something to prove.
Oh, yeah.
And what happened?
Well, he had a fight in Pontypridd, and he fought 3 fighters in the same night. Knocked the first one out in the first round, second one in the second round, the third one in the third round.
That's remarkable.
Yeah. Unbelievable, yeah. Then I really got to know him. Then they started to realise how good he was, I think.
With 3 scalps in one evening, Freddie made his point. Now everyone in his hometown knew exactly who he was. And not just Pontypridd. The boxer some people thought was an American was now unmistakably Freddie Welsh of Wales.
Just as he'd promised, Freddie fought his way into Welsh hearts. And in 1907, there was a very different scene at Pontypridd station. This time, there was a big crowd to wave him off to America. And the station master gave the people permission to sing. And they serenaded Freddie with the popular song, "Farewell, My True Love." And Freddie listened proudly, a local hero, a star in Wales.
And not only in Wales. His scrapbooks cover his triumphant return to America and the way he just couldn't stop winning. The crowds grew larger, so did his confidence, and so did his bank balance. In 1908, he crossed the Atlantic again to challenge for the lightweight championship of Britain. The fight was at the National Sporting Club in London, where he'd been successful the year before. The reigning champion, Johnny Summers, put up a brave show. But after 20 grueling rounds, Freddie was the winner, with a Lonsdale belt to mark his triumph.
A British champion at last, and Freddie was at the peak of his form. It seems that few men could topple him. But there was one strong contender who promised a sensational fight. And so in December 1910, a crowd packed into the roller skating rink that stood here at Westgate Street in Cardiff to see Freddie take on another Welsh hero, Jim Driscoll.
Jim Driscoll was brought up in the Irish community in Cardiff. Had an extremely difficult time as a young man. But when he took his first steps in the boxing profession, created a huge impact, became a huge favourite, And again, a classic boxer. Absolutely classic.
You have two people who are representative of two different strands in South Wales. Jimmy Driscoll, from the Irish Catholic Cardiff community, Freddie Welsh, the Valley's Welsh. And it was seen as a clash of almost two cultures.
In the run-up to the fight, the newspapers cranked up the tension and trumpeted a battle royal. They seemed to relish the prospect of a bitterly fought bloodbath. But in reality, outside the ring, the two boxers were pretty good friends.
They certainly get on, and there are one or two photographs of them together in their suits and their fob chains and their boaters. I don't think that they particularly wanted to go head-to-head, but publicity and the pressure of events was pushing them towards each other.
And of course, they were serious professional fighters, and there was no room for friendship in the unforgiving ring. To win the match, Freddie was prepared to be utterly ruthless and cut corners.
Freddie Welsh has acquired by this time not only an American accent, but also an American style of fighting, which was not too admired on this side of the Atlantic. Crouching, liberal use of the head and the elbows, kidney punching. During the fight, it's a 20-rounder, but during the fight, Freddie is putting all these dubious skills that he has acquired in America to the test, and he's trying them out on Jim, who doesn't like it. By round 10, Jim Driscoll becomes so enraged, so frustrated, he just loses his rag completely. He butts Freddie Welsh, drives him across the ring, and the ref has no option but to disqualify Jim Driscoll, and the victory goes to Freddie Welsh.
It turned out to be a dirty, bad-tempered contest. There were lots of infringements on Freddie's part, and Jim Driscoll, the great sportsman that he was, eventually losing his temper and headbutting Freddie. It was amazing, wasn't it? Absolutely amazing, that. And of course they had to call the police to quell the riot in the building.
The Driscoll fight cast a shadow over Freddie, and then he lost his British title to Matt Wells. But he bounced back and regained his title in 1912, then set his sights on becoming world lightweight champion. But he had to wait a while to get a crack at it.
A number of champions were reluctant to take him on, and it wasn't until 1914 that, at last, Willie Ritchie of San Francisco agreed to meet him. The fight was fixed for London's Olympia, and in preparation, Freddie moved to Porthcawl, his mother's home, and trained by running relentlessly across the sands. As the day of the fight grew nearer, the boxing fans of Wales were fizzing fit to burst.
There is tremendous excitement regarding it, as you can imagine, in South Wales. There are busloads, there are coachloads going up to Olympia.
Contemporary reports are fascinating, and they refer to this huge cavernous arena in London, echoing to the sounds of My Heimlad Fy Nhadau. The reports also indicate that Freddie Welsh was at his very best that night. The jab was working perfectly. His defence was absolutely impeccable. He was firing on all pistons, there is no doubt about it.
The fight started at 10 p.m. and a crowd jostled outside the Western Mail offices in Cardiff. These people couldn't wait for the morning paper. They wanted the news as soon as it broke. And at 11:30, an excited reporter rushed out of the building. "Freddie," he said, "Freddie, on points." Some of the crowd were still celebrating at dawn.
It's not hard to understand the exultation. Wales had never before had a world boxing champion. No wonder the headlines were as red as a dragon. Freddie showed his gratitude to his Welsh fans. He returned home and staged exhibition bouts as a thank you. But Wales couldn't hang on to him for long.
Freddie Welsh was such an astute businessman that he saw the possibilities instantly of returning to America and engaging in no-decision contests where his title was effectively safe. He engaged in a huge number of these over the next 3 years and made huge money out of the title.
Freddie was in his prime, a celebrity and loving it. Americans flocked to his fights and read every word the reporters wrote about him. Freddie's wife, Fanny, whom he'd married secretly 10 years before, was now regularly brought into the story, and so were his 2 children. The happy home life of a champion. But how long could it all last?
Freddie was popular and wealthy and seemed to have it all. But he was growing rather old for a fighter. Started drinking, no longer trained as conscientiously as he once did. He was fraying round the edges. In 1917, he lost his world title to Benny Leonard, a much younger boxer, a defeat that signalled his great days were over. The curtain was falling.
His last fight is against Archie Walker in Brooklyn in 1921. Then he establishes a health and fitness farm in Upper New York State for sort of businessmen and tired lawyers who come to sort of recreate their lost youth so they can keep pace with the roaring 20s. That farm initially in the early 20s was prosperous. Jack Dempsey is a regular attender. There is some footage of him playing with Freddie Welsh's children who knock him out and so forth. But by the mid-20s, things are going seriously wrong.
He was a great socialite, moved in fantastic circles, earned so much respect. But he, of course, couldn't take account of the deteriorating economic situation, and sadly, everything was lost. There was a drink problem. He had separated from his wife and family, and he died alone near Broadway.
Freddie Welsh was found dead in his New York hotel room in July 1927. A heart attack, it was said, though sleeping pills were found nearby, and most people concluded that he'd taken his own life. A sad end for a dynamic sportsman who'd given so much pleasure to so many fans in Britain and America. For Freddie Welsh, the champ, the last headline.
He was just 41 when he died. A sad ending, but his achievement was inspiring. The schoolboy who had to fight for breath fought to make himself a world champion. Freddie Welsh was one of the finest athletes ever made in Wales. His remarkable personal record in the National Library will ensure that his story is remembered.